we'll just do a little breathing meditation and a motivation to start, and then there'll be opportunity if you've got other questions from last week. So just sitting comfortably, remembering the main thing about our posture when we're meditating is to be comfortable. And within that, having our back straight, but not rigid, in a relaxed way. And then just gently close your eyes or look down at a spot about 1 metre or so in front of you. And gently check through your body to see if there's any tension or discomfort, and just readjust your posture. And then bring your attention to the breath, wherever's going to be most suitable for you, how you feel comfortable with watching the breath. And the whole purpose of the breathing meditation is to settle our mind, get it focused on just one thing, and this develops our concentration. And when we can develop a strong, concentrated mind to bring to our meditation and our teachings, the study we do, then that's going to benefit us in those activities and any other activities that we do that require concentration. We'll make less mistakes. And then in setting a motivation, this is setting a clear goal. So we can see if we're actually moving towards achieving that goal. And we can think about goals for ourselves and also goals for others. In terms of goals for others, of course, it's what we might be able to achieve for them if we were completely free of whatever obstacles we have, things like illness or, difficulties we might have. So those two goals are often closely aligned. So whenever we experience these obstacles or difficulties in our life, we can think that there are others too experiencing exactly the same or similar types of problems, whether that's a physical illness, an emotional upset, stress or anxiety, problems with personal relationships, whatever it might be. We can think that we're doing this little beginning meditation for them as well as for us. And in this way, we adjust our motivation to be personal and also expansive, free of bias. So it includes all living beings without any exceptions. We're going to do this by developing the 4 immeasurable thoughts. Firstly, immeasurable loving kindness. Imagine what the world would be like if all living beings had happiness and all the causes of happiness, everything they needed and wished for. Take a few moments to imagine how different the world would be. Imagine how everyone you know would act if they had happiness and the causes of happiness. How people would naturally treat each other with kindness and joy. Secondly, immeasurable compassion. Imagine if all living beings were free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Imagining this happening to the people closest to you, to your family and friends. Then imagine this happening for the people you don't know, but you know about. People in the news, people we've heard about from our friends or family. And finally, imagining how all the destructive people would act if they were free from suffering and the causes of suffering. All the people who've hurt or upset you, how they would act completely differently if they were free from their disturbing emotions and unhappiness. Thirdly, immeasurable joy. Allow a great wish to arise in your heart that all living beings never be separated from the happiness that's without suffering, and that they abide in a state of lasting joy. And finally, may all the living beings in the world abide in equanimity, free from both clinging attachment for friends, aversion and hatred for others, completely free of prejudice and preconceived ideas. And then when you're ready, just slowly open your eyes. So, are there any questions from last week? We covered a fair bit of territory last week.
No, but thank you.
So this week we're going to look at finding a spiritual guide, our main spiritual teacher. And this can be quite a very tricky topic, because as human beings sometimes we, overreact one way or another. And so we need to be very clear about our spiritual teacher. And so we might have many teachers, we can learn about things reading a book from different teachers, different traditions. We can learn things from someone who's been teaching the Buddha's even if someone gives us the advice that they found this book useful. that sort of thing. This is some guidance coming from someone who has a bit more experience than us. It's a book that they've read. And it may or may not suit us, but even if we don't feel it's the most fantastic book we've ever read, you know, there may well be something in there that just helps us, triggers us to think about something else, and to think, I'd like to know more about that particular thing. So we need to be careful, not just rush into saying, this is my main teacher for this life. When someone's charismatic and wonderful and has a nice way of speaking, or just teaches things that make us feel good, it's important that as students we use our intelligence and our common sense to gradually and slowly over time determine whether this is our main teacher. Looking at, we're going to go through the qualities of the teacher. Are they, is this person actually got those qualities? What they are teaching, is it in line with Buddhism, as, you know, His Holiness teaches, or Lama Zopa Rinpoche, or that sort of thing? Is it in line with our reality, the reality of life, or is it, you know, different to that, a bit airy-fairy? Is it reasonable? Buddha said, you know, the teaching should be based on reason and logic, not just some, you know, lovely idea. There's nothing wrong with the lovely idea, but it isn't necessarily a Buddhist idea. So, you know, we can check. It doesn't mean we have disrespect for someone if they aren't exactly doing this or that. It's just, you know, we need to be aware that this may be our main teacher or maybe not, but we need to be clear in our mind what it is that we're doing. And so Buddha said we need to not just know things intellectually, but we need to be putting them into practice. And for us, as well as the teacher, are they saying one thing and doing something completely else? Are they saying, for instance, it's we shouldn't be taking intoxicants, but maybe they are, but maybe there's a reason they are. We need to check, you know. Maybe they're taking some medicine that's, you know, herbal medicine that's in some tincture or something, and it's for their health. You know, we just need to be really careful, not just jump in and make assumptions. What we're really looking for is a teacher who's progressed further along the path than we have, and they are willing to teach, willing to help us progress a bit further along our path. So last week we talked about Buddha, who initially was not going to teach because it seemed like it was too hard. So we have to keep in mind that sometimes people who have progressed on the spiritual path, they may not be teachers, they may be meditators or whatever they might be, artists, different things, but they may not be direct teachers as such. So we're aiming to achieve a goal of enlightenment, nirvana or liberation along the way. You know, whichever our goal is, we're wanting our teachers to help us progress towards that goal. And so we need to become active participants in this. We're not just sitting there waiting for someone to come by and say, hi, I'm your main teacher of this lifetime. But it's not that, we don't need to be that passive. It doesn't happen quite that way. Sometimes on occasions it does, but it's more likely that we're going to have to, you know, put some effort into finding a reliable teacher. But if we know what the qualities we're looking for in a teacher, this will definitely help us. So our own capacity to achieve enlightenment, we develop this because we develop our Buddha nature or our Buddha potential that is within us. and within all living beings. This is what we're trying to develop. And so we do this by developing our wisdom, the wisdom that, the teachers have developed and refined over a lot of study. And there's the wisdom that comes from study and from learning. This is one of the wisdoms that we definitely need initially. And then there's a wisdom that comes from reflecting on the teachings, looking at whether or not this makes any sense in our lives, in what way can we put it into our life, contemplating what's the best use we can make of whichever things that we've learned. And sometimes there are different things that are taught and they're not useful for us at this time. And the Dalai Lama himself has said, after he'd taught for 5 days, whatever is useful for you in these teachings, use that. Put that into practice. The things that are not useful for you at the moment, just leave them aside. Don't go focusing on them. They might have been very useful for someone else because he was teaching to thousands of people. So they might have been very useful for some of the other people here, and they may well be useful for you later on in life. So just put into practice, make use of what we can at the time, and gradually over time, we'll be able to use different aspects of the teachings. And then when we've decided that this would be helpful for me at this time, then we meditate on those things and develop our inner qualities, develop our patience, our kindness, our compassion, whatever it might be, that we've identified for ourselves that we need to strengthen at this time. If we decide we're too easily impatient or whatever it might be, that there are situations where we're not always kind. So we try to develop the antidotes to those qualities. And so we strengthen the patience, the kindness, whatever it might be, so that they can influence our actions of body, speech and mind rather than the impatience and the unkindness. So this is gradually, this is how we progress. Identifying what it is we see that we can change now, and it would be beneficial if we did that. So why do we need a spiritual teacher to do that? We could just read that in a book, couldn't we? We could read a book on kindness or compassion or patience and go, yeah, I need to do more of that. Read it a couple of times, think, yep, that'll be helpful. Find a meditation, that'll be good. Well, it's not always that simple, It's not always that simple. There are people called solitary realisers, but in previous lives they've done a lot of study, contemplation, meditation, and most of us are not able to access what we've learned in past lives in the way that they can. So for your interest, they're called rhinoceros-like because rhinoceroses live on their own.
So Jan said sometimes reading it in a book doesn't always have the necessary impact.
Well, that's possibly true. And the other thing, you can't ask questions of the book. You can see it in the book, but when you ask a question, if you've got a teacher, then you can ask a question and clarify things where there might be doubt.
And I have plenty of questions.
Well, you just type them into the chat when we comes out. When I first started coming to the teachings at Lhagsam and Chenrezig, I had been reading Buddhist books and things for quite some years, but I'd just accept whatever was in the book, because what did I know for a start, and who could I ask? So sometimes people would ask questions and I didn't even understand the question, let alone how they got to join 2 or 3 things together in one go and say, so how do they logically fit together? All these sorts of questions, I had no idea. So often it's like that if we just read the book. We see things as separate. But if we're going to incorporate them all into our life, we need to know how they connect together. So often at the beginning of the teachings about the spiritual teacher, there's this idea of guru devotion. And it's not a wrong idea at all. But sometimes the word devotion can make us feel a little bit uneasy because we sort of equate it with either blind faith or mindless submissiveness or just doing what we're told or something like that. But in Buddhism, that's not what we're actually talking about here. Probably holding our teacher in high regard or with great respect, these are probably a better description of the attitude we need to develop. If we really respect someone, we're more likely to be able to understand their teachings. We'll be more willing to sit and listen and that sort of thing and follow their advice. And if you think about teachers when you're at school and things like that, if you really liked your teacher, you'd be much more likely to do your homework. If you didn't care much for the teacher, well, you're probably a bit like, oh. So, you know, we have to think about for ourselves, you know, what would this mean? How would this make any difference whatsoever? But there is a difference. So having this positive attitude, we can see this when we look at our family and our friends. You know, they love us, they care for us, they'll help us when we need help. And so this is similar in a way with our teacher. They do care, they do want to help us. They do want to help us progress on our spiritual path. So they develop kind thoughts and put a lot of energy into teaching and answering questions, things like this. So we talked about refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha. And so this attitude of respect or devotion is in relation to that as well. The two are connected together. Refuge is this attitude of relying or turning towards someone for guidance and help. And so we can take refuge in worldly things, but in Buddhism we're looking at these three jewels of refuge that we discussed. So there's the outer refuge of the Buddha, the statues, the Dharma, the texts and books, and the Sangha, those that are practicing the path, maybe have more experience than us, can help us along the way. And certainly the Arya Sangha, those that have achieved the path of seeing and are on those higher paths and have developed qualities within themselves that help them to benefit others. And of course, you know, the refuge in the Dharma is the inner Buddha is our own Buddha potential, our Buddha nature, and then opening ourselves to trying to develop that. And the Dharma is understanding inside us, you know, these teachings and putting them into practice as much as we can. And so, and the inner Sangha is being aware, you know, that there's guidance and inspiration that we can develop a bit for ourselves to actually think about what is it I should do here? How do I help myself in this situation in a way that helps others as well? So, you know, being aware of examples of particular teachers, these others that we've seen managing a situation, that sort of thing, and remembering that and following those examples as much as we can. So when we're learning something, learning to drive is a good example. Most Australians drive. And so we might have friends who, I learnt to drive a long time ago, so various friends would say, do you want to have a go? Usually after we'd had way too much to drink, but they didn't have breathalyzers then. And it's a wonder we survived as well as we did, but that's true of people today as well, you know. Many new drivers do dangerous things, many old drivers do dangerous things. But we can learn from our various friends and relatives. Some might be good drivers, some might be bad drivers, you know, with always getting tickets for speeding or something. And we don't want to develop bad habits. If we develop bad habits, it's hard to undo them. If we learn from a professional instructor, you know, they're right up to date with the changed road rules, and, you know, they're specifically going to teach you exactly what it is you need to know to be as good a driver as you can. And when it comes to the test, we're confident, you know, that sort of thing. We haven't got a lot of anxiety. So ideally, we don't develop bad habits. We learn from someone who's some of the best teachers we can find. That's the way to avoid developing the bad habits in the first place. So in the teachings, the teachers are sometimes talked about as gurus or lamas, whatever. And so it's good to know the meaning of those, because, you know, we've got coffee gurus and whoever else, you know, fitness gurus, all sorts of different things. And so the word's been brought, like many other words from different languages, into the English language. But it means someone who's, you know, got some expertise. In Sanskrit, guru is a Sanskrit word, it means heavy with knowledge. So not just, that's a literal translation. So a lot of knowledge, but also experience and putting it into practice, not just intellectual knowing stuff. And then the Tibetan word is lama, so similar explanation. So when we, as I say, the words have been, you know, brought into the English language and mean any number of things. So when we're looking for the qualities of a spiritual teacher, there's a sutra called the Ornament for the Mahayana Sutras that talks about 10 qualities that we should look for in a spiritual teacher. And so I'll go through these, and you can try and, if you want to make notes or something of the list, that's fine. But they mean in specific things. So the first one is that the mind of the spiritual teacher is completely subdued by training in ethics or morality or ethical discipline, however it's translated, by the vows that they've taken, refuge vows, bodhisattva vows. And so it's not specifically mentioned, but if there are other vows that the person's taken, whatever they might be, that they actually, their mind has taken those vows in and they live as much as possible within those vows. Now, it's not up to our mind, up to us to say to our teacher, you shouldn't be doing this or that, because we might have a misconception, as I said before, about exactly what that might mean. And so, but a mind that's subdued and governed, I suppose, so that the actions of this person are ethical. And the second quality is about the higher training in concentration. So concentration is one of the 6 perfections, and we'll look at that in more detail next week. But this, when we have, the more concentrated a mind we might have, the more we can remember the teachings, remember whatever vows we may or may not have taken, remember our spiritual goals, and so then that mind is peaceful and calm and clear and able to deal with, because upsetting things happen, you know. Sometimes you think, oh, those people living up there in retreats, ordained. What do they know about the troubles I have? Not quite like that. I'm the voice of experience. But that they deal with whatever happens with a calm, peaceful mind that's developed through developing concentration. The third quality, again, the mind that's peaceful and subdued by the higher training in wisdom. So having this subdued mind due to ethics, concentration and wisdom are the first three qualities we're looking for. If someone has not developed their wisdom enough to know what's virtuous and what's non-virtuous and that sort of thing, this is where we fall to making mistakes. And we're going to look at the 10 non-virtues and the 10 virtues next week as well. So the fourth quality is that the teacher must have more knowledge on the particular subject matter than the student. Now, it might be that we know lots of stuff that our teachers don't. We might know how to drive, how to negotiate Centrelink, which is a uni degree in itself, all sorts of things. But in terms of Buddhist training, progressing on the Buddhist spiritual path, we need that the teacher have, gained more knowledge than us on that particular matter. Now, it isn't necessarily that the teachers have gained more knowledge on every aspect of the spiritual path either. So Lama Atisha, who 1,000 years ago took these teachings into Tibet, he had more knowledge on some of the philosophical studies than a particular teacher who he called his kindest teacher. He said his kindest teacher was Lama Tsongkhapa, because Lama Tsongkhapa taught him all about bodhicitta, and he was more proficient in that aspect. In terms of the wisdom aspect, then Lama Atisha knew more. But he said Lama Tsongkhapa was his kindest teacher. So we need to, not be thinking that there's only one teacher can teach us this thing. We can learn from anyone who knows more than us, someone who's maybe been studying longer, had the opportunity to have teachings from different teachers, all sorts of things. The fifth quality of the spiritual teacher is having joyful perseverance in the acts of benefiting others. And this can be a very tricky thing. Not that that it's tricky for the teachers, but for us to be careful. And, our teachers want to benefit us in terms of our progress on the spiritual path. They don't always have the capacity to accommodate us and all sorts of things, particularly here in the West. Now, traditionally in Tibet and now in southern India, if a student is accepted by a teacher, then they move into accommodation close to that teacher, a monastery or something like that, and that teacher's monastery looks after them, gives them food and clothing and things like this. That's not how it works here. Our main teachers are refugees. They're not able to do that sort of thing. Sometimes there's particular opportunities to live or study at a Dharma centre, something like that, but we can't have that expectation. But that doesn't mean that our spiritual teacher doesn't wish, to be able to benefit us, and would wish that we find that to do those other things, those things of this lifetime. Their joy, their perseverance is in helping us understand the spiritual path. The sixth quality is being rich in hearing all the oral transmissions of the sutras and tantras. So the oral transmissions, these are, are traditionally very important. In 2,500 years ago, people were not literate, and so having the oral transmission was the way of developing knowledge. And still in the monasteries, the Tibetan monasteries at least, part of the training early on is in actually learning to recite the different texts. Now just excuse me for a minute.
That's like recite by memory, isn't it?
That is recite by memory. So I was fortunate enough to spend 4 weeks in Kopan Monastery, where they the monastery is supported by offering classes for Western students. And I spent 4 weeks there in 1998, and it was amazing and fabulous. And in the evenings, because there were about 300 monks there, I think, at the time, and so they had classes during the day. In the evenings, they had a certain amount of text to commit to memory. They had to be able to recite these texts. And so the tiny little ones, they'd have to learn a few lines or whatever they learned. I don't know. It was all in a foreign language to me. And the older students would hear them, you know, hear them recite. And then when they got it right, when they could say it, then they could go to bed or go and watch debate or whatever they wanted to do. The older ones then had to go and learn theirs. They had to learn whatever it was. So each day they learnt another part of whichever text it was they were memorising. Now I've heard one of the nuns who has travelled in Tibet say that by the age of 18, if someone's very clever and has good memory and puts a lot of effort in, by the age of 18, they've memorised the main texts that are taught in the monastery. Because the reason for this, because in the monastery, they don't have traditionally the capacity to print out, you know, 100 copies of this and 100 copies of that for every student. And they don't have the resources, the money, whatever it might be. And they actually share, they'll have one copy of a text and they share it and learn different pages and things like this. And so then when they've learnt it, then when their teacher's talking about it, then it's in their mind. They can follow along in their mind. They don't have to have it in front of them. And sometimes the teachers, they'll get a bit, they'll be talking about something and maybe get a little bit distracted, or they'll be trying to recall a quote from a particular teaching, and you'll see them going, and they're checking in them, where's that, you know, what was the exact quote from which sutra or which teacher, you know, and they have all that in their mind. They're just able to quote this or that particular thing that's an example from a particular sutra. And so hearing these oral transmissions helps with that memory. And it's then you have the oral transmission, then you start the learning. When Lama Zopa Rinpoche was here, he gave us the oral transmission of the foundation of all good qualities, a quite short text, 14 or 16 four-line verses. And so at time, we just listen and let that sort of sink into us. And so if we don't, if it's said if we, hearing this helps the teacher to benefit us. So the seventh of these qualities is said to be the teacher should have the direct realisation of emptiness, or at least an inferential realisation of emptiness, an understanding of what it means, and have thought about that and not have doubts about what it means. So any teacher you ask will say they don't have any realisations, and the Dalai Lama will say he's just a simple monk. And in the teachings, if you saw them recently, he said sometimes people think I'm Chenrezig or something, he's said that many times, because people do, because of his compassion, people equate him with being an emanation of Chenrezig, and he certainly acts like that, but he will deny it, and they all will, because of how others would relate to them, how others might ask them, you know, really difficult personal questions, or all sorts of things. People might draw back and feel, well, I'm not, you know, ready for going to those teachings now, or I can't, you know, I won't be able to understand because he's such a high teacher, whatever it might be. Others might become overly clingy and not want to do anything until they've checked with the Dalai Lama, or all this sort of thing, or the teacher. So they generally say, you know, no, I have intellectual knowledge, I don't have realizations.
So how can you tell, you know, I mean, some of the things like the ethical conduct you can tell, but how can you tell there whether someone actually has a direct realization of emptiness if they're all going to deny it?
Well, the thing is, until we've got a direct realization of emptiness, well, we probably can't. But of these 10 qualities, there are 5 that are really essential. So when I finish these, I'll talk about the 5 that are essential. Sometimes you can not tell, but we can infer, because someone has the capacity, well, at least has clairvoyance, and at least has knowledge other than we have. And so if you want an example, one of those examples would be from Lama Zopa Rinpoche's advice regarding the big statue at Atisha Centre. So a big stupa there, sorry. And so this is millions of dollars worth of building. It's huge, and it's got a whole lot of steel work. It's about $250,000 for each floor of just the steel work and all that sort of thing. And so while people were trying to raise this money and stuff, and this happened long ago, and I was like, oh, well, I don't understand any of this. Lama Zopa commissioned the jade Buddha statue. So this was a lot of money, first buying the jade and then paying for the sculptors to carve it and everything. And it's a very beautiful statue. It's actually exactly the same proportions as the statue that's in the stupa, the Mahabodhi stupa at Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha became enlightened. You know, just, you know, a few metres, it's inside the building, that statue, a few metres from the tree, you know, where the tree was, the original tree where the Buddha sat and became enlightened. So, you know, it's an amazing thing. And so it was taking, you know, a couple of years for each level of, first of all, getting the site prepared, then the foundations, and then suddenly it was like, it had bolted ahead. And I said to one of the people who works at Chenrezig quite often, and I said, how come did you get struck down by $1 million or something? How did it come suddenly the building's progressing so quickly? He's on the committee that went into Tibet and measured the original building, etc. Anyway, he said, well, it's the jade Buddha. I said, what are you talking about? So the jade Buddha was taken round to many countries. And he said, people just throw money at it. People want to make offerings to it. And because of that, we'll be able to progress much more quickly. That's how we've been able to progress so quickly with the fundraising. And the jade Buddha doesn't travel around the world now. It is in Bendigo and there to stay, unless, you know, Lama Zopa sees there would be benefit to take it somewhere else, but that's the current plan for it. So to me, this was quite outstanding, that you're trying to build several $1 million building and you divert about $1 million of your funds to building a statue. I could not see any, but I accepted there'd be a reason. And then there was the reason. So the question?
So then the question, just to clarify, so a direct realization of emptiness, and you're kind of like talking about what to me sounds like, dependent arising. So if, for a beginner, what do you quite mean by emptiness?
So emptiness is, dependent arising is exactly that. Emptiness is a lack of inherent existence, that things don't inherently exist, that they exist in dependence on other things. They arise from other causes and conditions. But how many of us would have had that clairvoyance, insight, inspiration, whatever, to think this will help build this, taking this great chunk of jade from somewhere up in Canada or somewhere where it was actually in a mine, taking it to Nepal, I think, to be carved, and that this would then create more resources than it costs to actually make the statue. And so Lama Zopa was able to see that this would create the causes, if you like, to actually be able to do that in a virtuous way. People came to see Jade Buddha and just
really
were overwhelmed. Really, it's a fabulous thing if you ever have the opportunity to see it. It's really quite outstanding. It was here in Brisbane at one time for a few days. It's really an inspiring thing to see. And then the eighth quality is that the teacher's skilled in expressing him or herself in order to be able to guide the disciples, that they can, and it's really hard. These teachings originally written in Sanskrit or Pali and then translated into Tibetan and now translated into English and other languages. But having that, that ability to express and I guess make the teachings relevant for us 2,500 years ago, ahead of when the Buddha taught. And the ninth one is having loving concern or an affectionate concern for the student, really caring about their progress, about their situation in this life, so that it's conducive to study. And so great concern for the student. And then the 10th quality is that they should not be easily fed up by having to repeat things, having to explain again and explain again, so as we eventually get to understand. So great patience. And then to answer part of your question before about the realizations of emptiness, so even if the other 10 qualities are lacking, or not all of them are there, there are some that are essential. It's said that at least the teacher must have trained in ethics, concentration, and wisdom. So those first three qualities, and have their mind subdued and be applying those, and have that thought of loving concern for the disciple. I guess, it would be so much easier for our teachers to just talk in Tibetan, which is their original language, not have to wait for the translator, not have to think, did that translator translate it properly? Then get a question from a student that identifies that it wasn't translated how they meant it to be, etc., etc. But our teachers, they have this concern. And besides these inner qualities, that the qualified spiritual teacher should have listened extensively to the oral transmissions. It's said that all our great teachers, like His Holiness Lama Zopa Rinpoche, they've received these oral transmissions in a steady line, a traceable line from the Buddha himself, that these have been transmitted orally all the way down from the Buddha. And so it's also said that the best spiritual teachers have these qualities, but we should, if we can't find someone like that, we should at least find someone, a teacher who thinks that our future lives are just as important as this one, and we should have that idea too, because if we think we're doing something just for this life, well, we could probably go and have a massage and coffee or whatever. With our spiritual life is for this life and our future lives. And it said it can take us up to 12 years to find our main spiritual teacher, but hopefully not quite so long. Hopefully not quite so long. So it said that it's impossible to know someone's inner qualities and realisations in particular. So because of that, we can see whether the teacher's speech, their attitude, these sorts of things infer that they have those inner qualities. Sometimes there are external signs that someone's got some realisation about the value of these teachings. So one example of that again was Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who in 2011 was teaching in Bendigo and had a stroke, which was a big shock to everyone. And he was in hospital and couldn't continue the teachings, couldn't be in Melbourne when the Dalai Lama was there, which was the plan, all these different things. But what he could do, he couldn't feed himself. So his students, you know, cooked the food he was used to and that sort of thing, because hospital food isn't much like the food we eat, and it's absolutely nothing like the food that Tibetans and Nepalese eat. But what he did do, given that he couldn't do his normal activities like teaching, he practiced Tonglen all the time. He did Tonglen for all the people. So Tonglen's giving and taking, remembering, you know, that others have suffering and taking in their suffering with the breath, giving out your happiness to the others, those others that have had strokes, the other people currently in the hospital he was in, all the people who'd previously been in the room he was in and the hospital he was in, all the people who'd previously been in a bed with these particular hospital sheets on them, all the different people that were caring for all of those who were sick. And he just made this so extensive, such a lovely example of even if we can't do this or we can't do that, there are things we can do. So that was really wonderful. So in order to, you know, meet with our teachers, we need to accumulate our karma to meet with our teachers. So when we want to examine something, we make sure our glasses are clean and we've got good light and whatever it might be. Or we look through binoculars or a microscope, however it might be. So we need to do that in terms of looking for a spiritual teacher. We need to clean away our obscurations, our preconceived ideas about a teacher should look like this or that, or give me things I want, or whatever it might be, and come to see, you know, the pure and holy beings now on this planet, but also, you know, the positive qualities in others as well, that they're a reflection of the teachers that they've had, even if they're not direct spiritual Buddhist teachers. Someone who's really kind and patient is an embodiment of patience. You know, they're kind and patient, and we can think, maybe from that person we can learn patience, even if we haven't met our main teacher of this life or had teachings on patience. If patience is something we need to learn, maybe the example of someone else who may or may not have a spiritual tradition, may be able to help us see the benefits of patience and think about how could I develop this myself. So it's important that we look for and find a Mahayana spiritual teacher as a guidance for us to follow our spiritual path. But, you know, that's not always easy. So as we come to understand more, we can see these qualities of the teachers. And if we can see the qualities of those teachers, 5 or 8 or 10, then we can regard that teacher as someone who's progressed further than us. And whether whether they're well known or not, whatever it might be. If we haven't met with many of the pure holy teachers yet, we can look at ways to meet them, and in some ways that's easier now than it ever was. You know, at one time you had to go to India. Well, you know, there's no going to India now. The people who are Australians in India are having all kinds of trouble getting back to Australia. All sorts of things like this. And we can also, you know, dedicate to coming in contact with a teacher and having the motivation that we are able to do that, and, you know, have the aspiration that we never be separated from them in this life or our future lifetimes. So many of us are fortunate we've taken direct teachings from His Holiness. But, you know, we can be really grateful for the technology that a couple of weekends ago allowed us to take direct teachings from the Dalai Lama in the privacy of our own homes. When I first came to these teachings, the teachers would allow you to take notes or to record the teachings at the beginning when it was the motivation, the reason for giving the initiation, that sort of thing. But when it actually came to the initiation, they'd request that was turned off, that this was not recorded, that this was not distributed, because the initiation was for those there in person. And traditionally, initiations were just for a few people, the teacher and their main students. But then as the teachings moved to the West, it became for greater numbers to directly receive those initiations, because we could travel more easily and see the teachers. But because of His great kindness and His wish to benefit others, His Holiness has allowed that He use this technology to help us in this time, and said that it's really beneficial at this time, particularly to practice developing our compassion, developing harmony with others. And so He gave, you know, this Chenrezig initiation, the subsequent permission of Singanada. And so we're very fortunate, because the Dalai Lama used to travel to Australia every couple of years, but now he's older and he can't. So we don't have to go to India.
Yeah.
We can stay right here and have these wonderful teachings.
And have a front row seat.
Indeed, a front row seat. So when we find a suitable teacher, whether it's someone you know directly, whether it's someone like His Holiness, whoever it might be, and there's this special relationship or connection, this is a very, very precious thing. So sometimes students make offerings to their teachers, but the great teachers always say the best offering is to study and do whatever we can to put the teachings into practice in our lives, in our actions of our body, our speech, our mind, to really try and incorporate these teachings into ourselves. Not just study, contemplate, meditate, and then do the best we can to apply them in our lives. So, are there any questions at the minute? No? Well, we might have a little break now and